Good evening. You're listening to the After Dark Historian, where the echoes of history speak softly long after night has fallen. Tonight, you're invited into a world both familiar and foreign, a world of sand, sweat, quiet waiting, and the ever-present risk of farewell. Not the grand tales of emperors or generals, not the shouts of victory or the clang of swords, but the quieter rhythm of a woman's life, spent alongside a man who fought for survival in the dust of the arena. She was not famous. She left no letters, no sculptures, no marble inscriptions, but she waited every day for the sound of footsteps returning home from the Ludasa, the training school. She stitched tunics, fetched water, and listened for rumors in the market. And on some days, she stood in the crowd, watching silently. This is her story. So now, breathe softly. Let your body relax and your thoughts drift gently. Imagine yourself in ancient Rome, not as a senator, not as a gladiator, but as someone who lived in the long shadow they cast. What was it like to be a gladiator's wife? Let us begin with the quiet rhythms of her daily life. It begins with a creak of sunlight slipping through the shutters. You rise before the city stirs fully, your fingers stiff with sleep, your feet finding their way across the smooth, uneven floor of your apartment. The air is warm already, though the sun has barely cleared the rooftops. Somewhere down the street, a merchant is banging open his stall. The scent of baking bread drifts faintly upward. Someone's child is crying. A dog barks once, then falls silent. You live in an insula of the many stacked dwellings in the middle districts of Rome. Your floor is high up, which means fewer rodents, but a longer climb with the amphora of water you carry every day. It also means you are closer to the sun and the dust that drifts in from the streets below. Your husband is already gone. He left before light, walking the quiet path to the Ludus, the Gladiator school, where the day begins with drills, muscle, and discipline. He did not speak. He rarely does on training days. The weight of silence hangs easily between you now. Not unfriendly, but tired. You sit by the window and begin your morning work. Your hands know the routine. There is fabric to patch coarse linen that frays at the shoulders where leather straps have rubbed. There is barley to grind, though you'll do it slowly, carefully, so the stone does not break again. You will visit the market, greet the woman who sells olives, and avoid the men who stand near the butcher's stall, loudly discussing tomorrow's games. They sometimes recognize you. They know your face, and though they say little, you've seen them whisper. The life of a gladiator's wife is not one of prestige. There is a shadow over your door, a certain glance in the eyes of others. Some believe you are a slave. Others assume you must be poor. A few are more curious than cruel. But no one envies you. Not really. Proper Roman matrons do not linger long when you pass. But there are others' wives of laborers, bakers, former slaves who smile and speak plainly. You swap advice on herbs, complain about prices, and occasionally, when the mood is right, you share what little you know of what happens behind the ludus walls. What you do know, you've learned in fragments: a bruise here, a torn sandal, a whisper about a new sponsor, or a match that went badly, or a name scratched off a roster. Evening is your quiet time. He returns when the sun leans low behind the tiled roofs. Some days his walk is steady. Other days his steps are slower. You can read the fatigue in his shoulders before he reaches the stairs. You greet him. Sometimes he nods. Sometimes he kisses your brow. But mostly, you begin preparing food lentils if there are any onions sliced into oil, stale bread softened with broth. He eats quickly, sometimes with his hands barely noticing the taste. You listen if he chooses to speak. He might mention a technique they practiced. The harsh words of a lanista trainer with little patience. He might mention another fighter's fall, or an offer from a wealthy patron, or nothing at all. You wash his tunic. You tend to small wounds when he allows it. And then you lie beside him, your bodies sharing warmth on the straw mat, your thoughts lingering in the dark. You wonder if he will be called to fight. You wonder if the new scars are from training or from something more. You wonder if he will come home again tomorrow. And so you close your eyes, not in fear, but in weary knowing. This is the life you live, a rhythm that holds for now. Now, let us drift back, further into the mist of memory. The names change, the streets fade into dust. But one name echoes quietly but persistently through the records left behind. Spartacus. You've heard his story before, perhaps whispers of rebellion, of broken chains, of bloodied sand, and defiant courage. But in the still hush of night, we turn our attention not to his sword, but to his silences, to the spaces between battles, to the woman who stood quietly by his side. She has no recorded name. The Roman historian Plutarch simply called her a woman of Thracian stock, who shared his tent during the rebellion. And yet, she was at the edge of one of history's most famous uprisings. Not a warrior herself, but a constant companion, a shadow beneath the trees, a presence beside the fire. Imagine her with him before it all began. She may have known Spartacus before the arena, perhaps in Thrace, or on the long, weary road to Roman captivity. Some say she was a seer woman of visions and signs. Others believe she was simply his wife. But what remains, softly and insistently, is that she was there. When he trained, when he fought, and later, when he chose not to be a gladiator anymore. The rebellion began in whispers. It was not glorious. It was not clean. It began with kitchen knives, stolen from the ludus, with fighters crawling under moonlight to find horses, wood, shelter. They fled south. She fled with them. In those first days, it was not a movement. It was a survival. The woman who loved Spartacus did not fight with a blade, but she endured. Through March's rain, hunger, and loss. She watched the group swell from dozens to hundreds, then thousands. Other women joined former wives, freed companions, escaped servants. Their names, too, are mostly lost, but they washed wounds. They cooked over low fires. They whispered encouragement when men faltered. They walked. Spartacus, it is said, sometimes fell silent after battles, not triumphant, not elated, just still. And in those silences, she sat beside him, perhaps touching his hand, perhaps saying nothing. Her presence was not the kind of history Rome chose to remember, but it shaped him. As the rebellion grew, so did the danger. Roman generals descended. Whole legions hunted them. The rebels were outnumbered, always, and yet they held. For over 2 years, they resisted. She remained with him, through the snows of winter, the blister of summer, and the whispers of betrayal. She likely held the names of the dead in her memory longer than most. She likely buried friends. She likely prepared meals when supplies were scarce and hunger pressed against every breath. In the end, the final battle came near the Silurus River. Spartacus fought. He fought knowing the odds, knowing the outcome, knowing it may be the end. And still he fought. What became of her is not known. No historian marked her last steps. No stone bears her name. But in the quiet hours, if you listen carefully, you may feel her story pressed gently against the pages of history. The rebellion she walked beside was crushed. Rome reasserted its power. But in the stillness that followed, the memory of a woman who dared to remain quietly lingers. And so we remember her now, with flames or fanfare, but with quiet breath, with a long gaze into the past, with the same patience she once offered to the man history would remember. As we prepare to descend into another realm of ancient wonder, now let your thoughts drift downward, below the roar of the crowd, beneath the glare of the sun, under the wooden floorboards of the Colosseum or the provincial arena. There lies another world, a quieter world, a more ancient, whispering one. Imagine yourself walking slowly through the dim, musty corridors beneath the amphitheater. It is early morning. No spectators have yet filled the seats. No sand has yet been bloodied. And yet, already, the air is thick, not just with dust and sweat, but with belief, with ritual, with fear and meaning stitched into every moment. You walk past cages, silent now, but holding animals just roused from slumber, lions pacing in shadows, bears groaning softly. You pass racks of armor, not gleaming like in the stories, but dulled with wear, nicked and mended. And beside all this, altars, small, makeshift, some no bigger than a dinner plate, others carved more carefully, tucked into niches in the walls, blackened with old smoke. The gladiators and those who loved them were deeply superstitious. Many came from lands where gods were part of the everyday, in streams, in clouds, in bones. And though Rome worshipped Mars, Jupiter, and the like, the arena had its own spiritual terrain, its own language of fear. Before stepping out into the sun, a fighter might whisper a chant taught to him in childhood. He might touch a charm tucked beneath his belt. He might spit precisely 3 times to the left. A wife, waiting in the shade, might press a hand to a worn coin, invoking Fortuna. Others tied knots in thread. Some lit oil lamps and stared into the flame until the names of the gods seemed to flicker behind their eyelids. But it wasn't just prayers and hope. There were darker traditions too. Small lead tablets were occasionally buried under the sands. These were called defictions, curse tablets. They bore inscriptions, often in jagged Latin or Greek, scratched hastily into soft metal. Let the arm of so-and-so grow weak. One might read, may his sight fail. Another, bind his strength, drain his courage, break his rhythm. These were not whispered blessings. They were targeted, directed, often paid for by rivals, or even desperate spouses seeking to sway fate. Imagine, then, being a wife in the stands, your husband below, preparing, and you clutching a small object in your hand. Is it protective or vengeful? Do you plead with the gods to spare him, or beg them to make him lethal? Even the amphitheater itself was designed to feel like a sacred place. Its layout echoed temples. The rituals of entry and exit were carefully managed. Trumpets sounded not just for show, but as symbolic signals. The release of animals was tied to astrological signs. The raising of the vela, the awning above the seats, was said to invite the gods to look down. After a bout ended, there was more ritual. If a man died, he might be touched with a mallet, or his body dragged with a hook. Actions thought to release lingering spirits. A figure dressed as Charon, the mythical ferryman of the dead, sometimes mimed a death stroke to hasten the soul's departure. For the wives and partners of gladiators, these customs became familiar, if not comforting. They did not live in a world of pure violence or spectacle. They lived in a world of signs and omens, where every bruise might carry meaning, every victory might be alone, repaid in fate. Some wives left tokens beneath the stands, offerings to Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, or to Mercury, messenger of the dead. Others simply stood, quiet, behind the wooden rails, eyes half closed, whispering old lullabies, as if memory itself might protect the one they loved. The games were not just contests, they were ceremonies, the blending of fear, faith, and performance. And the people, men and women, fighters and onlookers, all played their part. As the crowd grew louder above, as the horn sounded, as the sand shifted, a man would walk into the light, and behind him, invisible to all but her, walked the weight of belief, ritual, and devotion. Take a breath. In the silence that follows superstition, let us rise, now gentling, to the final layer of this ancient society. We've walked among the poor, the fighters, the forgotten, but now we turn our gaze upward. As we turn away from the dust and tension of the training grounds, from the sighs of wives watching men return bruised and breathless, we find ourselves walking through another Rome entirely. Here, the roads are wider, the villas rise higher, fountains babble in marble courtyards, and vines curl lazily around shaded porticos. This is the world of Rome's elite. And for them, the games were not a burden of survival, but an opportunity, a spectacle, a statement of wealth and control. Imagine a domus, a Roman noble's grand household, where preparations are underway for an upcoming set of games. The master of the house, perhaps a wealthy senator or an ambitious equestrian, is sponsoring a munus, a gladiatorial event offered to curry favor, display generosity, or honor the memory of a family member. Hosting games, after all, was as much a political tool as it was entertainment. Scrolls are unrolled, guest lists are reviewed, seating arrangements debated, slaves bustle with garlands and scented oils. Gladiators were currency in social maneuvering, admired, wagered upon, discussed like racehorses. Their strength belonged, however, temporarily to those who could afford them. And sometimes these patrons were women. Wealthy Roman matrons, cloaked in stolae and layered jewelry, might be whispered about for having favored certain fighters, a subtle nod to relationships that blurred social norms. These liaisons, real or rumored, scandalized Rome's moralists and delighted its gossipers. For the upper class, proximity to the danger and allure of the arena was intoxicating. Even from cushioned seats, beneath shaded awnings. While the wives of gladiators waited quietly for survival, Rome's elites reveled in the thrill of orchestration. They didn't feel the fear of the arena, only its echo, softened by distance and filtered through luxury. But occasionally, the two worlds touched. A noblewoman might pass a coin or a favor to secure the release of a particularly skilled fighter. A lanista, eager for powerful friends, might invite senators to dine and watch private bouts in smaller courtyards. Power flowed in many directions, and the arena was one of its most unpredictable currents. And so, beneath the surface of the blood and sand, the theater of Rome continued, where survival was entertainment for some, and an everyday, quiet hope for others. Let us now step away from both, from the velvet-draped boxes and the wooden barracks, and take a final breath. As we close this chapter of lives entwined with steel, sand, and shadowed love. And so, we step slowly away from the roar of the Roman amphitheater. The sand settles, the crowds thin, and the echoes of the arena begin to fade, like a dream receding at dawn. No, take a slow breath. Let the torchlit corridors and marble columns fall into the quiet distance of memory. Ahead, another path awaits us. This time, we travel further back, far beyond Rome's reach, beyond marble and mosaic, back to a time before empires bore iron and steel, to a world of clay tablets, reed boats, and ziggurats rising gently from the desert plain. You are no longer among warriors and senators. You are small, very small, barefoot on warm earth. The air smells of river silt and sweet dates. Cattle murmur in the distance. A breeze rustles the reeds of the Euphrates. You are a child in ancient Mesopotamia, and now let us gently begin this new journey into what it was truly like to grow up under the first skies of civilization. Tonight, let's gently turn the page to a civilization nestled between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, to a land often veiled in myth, but rooted in the real, patient rhythm of early cities, fields, and ziggurats. This ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. But rather than kings and conquests, tonight we will walk the quieter paths. We will explore what it was like not to rule, not to build temples or wage wars, but to grow up, to be small in a vast world of clay tablets, temple bells, and open skies. What was it really like to be a child in ancient Mesopotamia? Not just a name in a school tablet or a figure in a statue, but a living, breathing child with tiny sandals, calloused hands, dreams, chores, laughter, and fears. Tonight, we'll follow 4 threads through this world. First, the intimate texture of daily life, the toys, the food, the language of home. Then, a story. One child's path into scribal training, through clay and discipline, Next, a mystery. The ancient lullabies and protective spells woven around children's beds. And finally, we'll lift the curtain on the other side of childhood. The children of the elite, of temples, of palace households whose fates were far from simple. Where history does not shout, it whispers. Close your eyes, if you wish, and breathe slowly. As we drift back to a time before time was even measured in hours. Picture it now. The warm light of dawn casting soft gold across a flat-roofed village. The houses are built low from sun-dried bricks, their walls the color of sand after rain. Roosters crow. A clay pot cracks gently as it's pulled from a fire pit. And the hush of early morning is just beginning to yield to the rustle of waking life. This is southern Mesopotamia, perhaps around 2000 BCE, and you are no king, no priest, no warrior. You are a child, maybe 7, maybe 9. The day begins early, always early. The coolness before the desert heat is precious, and there is much to be done before the sun climbs high. The household moves like breath, steady, necessary. Your mother is grinding grain on a stone slab, her arms moving in a rhythm you've known since infancy. You might take a turn, if you're old enough, feeling the slow drag of the pestle as it softens the kernels into flour. Your father, if he is home and not working in a field or dock, is tending to tools or checking the clay jars where barley beer ferments in the shade. If you are a boy, you may run errands, fetching water from the nearby canal, carefully carrying it in heavy jars balanced on a woven pad, or helping in the fields where barley and flax stretch in neat rows, low and dry under the sun. If you are a girl, perhaps you help clean the hearth, braid your little sister's hair, or fold linens laid to dry overnight. You may help your mother prepare a small fire with dried dung or reeds, stirring a pot of lentils with your wooden spoon, slowly until it thickens. The work is light for your size, but not optional. Children are woven into the fabric of life, not idle, not invisible, just smaller hands in a larger rhythm. And between these labors, moments of quiet joy. You find a smooth shard of pottery, draw designs in the dust. You play pebble games with your brother, tossing stones to hit a circle drawn in the dirt. Or you carve little animal shapes from leftover clay, setting them in the sun to bake. You know the seasons by scent, the wet mud of flood time, The dry crackle of midsummer, the cooler hush of the planting months. Food is simple. Flatbread, torn and dipped into stew. Maybe dried fish or onions softened in oil. There is beer, thin and sour, even for children. Drunk through straws from a large communal pot to avoid the sediment. Sometimes there is fruit or a treat sweetened with honey or dates, eaten slowly, a rare delight. And when night comes, the city changes. The markets fall silent. The shadows stretch long. Torches flicker near temple walls, and prayers are murmured. Soft invocations to gods like Nana, the moon god, or Inanna, radiant and wild. Before bed, your mother might hum an old lullaby, perhaps the same her mother once sang. She might murmur a protective spell, invoking the goddess Ninasina to guard your sleep. And you lie there on a mat of woven reeds, feeling the coolness of evening on your face, the scent of dust and cooking ash in the air. You are a child, small in the eyes of your elders, but central in the heartbeat of this world. You do not know of future empires. You do not know that someday far-off people will study your cities, decode your cuneiform, marvel at your toys in museum glass. You only know the sound of water against clay, the softness of a sibling beside you, and the stars, thousands of them, in a sky without lights, blinking down from eternity. This is your world, and you are woven tightly into it, not as a footnote, but as a thread. Now, let the rhythm of your breath slow again. We leave behind the courtyard and the clay hearth and drift toward a quieter space, more formal, more structured, but no less steeped in tradition. You are still a child, but not an ordinary one. You are the son, or very rarely, the daughter of a family with ambition. A family that hopes you will rise, not through strength in the fields, but through knowledge etched in clay. Your future is not the plow or the basket, but the stylus and the tablet. You are a scribe's apprentice. Imagine the day begins early, just as before, but instead of the farm or the home, you walk through narrow lanes of sun-baked brick toward the Edaba, the tablet house, the Mesopotamian school. It is a place of deep silence and sudden scolding. The floor is strewn with discarded clay scraps. The scent of dust and red fibers fills the air. There are no colorful murals, no laughter echoing in bright halls. This is not school as you might know it now. It is more like training, an ancient, unyielding preparation for a life of service, precision, and memory. At the Edaba, you sit cross-legged with other boys your age, each with a fresh lump of damp clay and a stylus, often just a sharpened reed. Your first lessons are not in stories or science, but in marks, straight lines, curved wedges, triangular impressions, cuneiform. Over time, your hand will learn to shape thousands of symbols, each a subtle variant of pressure, angle, and space. You will copy proverbs, prayers, laws, and contracts over and over until your fingers ache and your eyes blur from the dim light. The teacher, often a retired scribe or temple official, watches you closely. He does not smile often. When your work is careless, he corrects it, not always kindly. Corporal punishment was not unusual. A lash from a reed switch, a sharp word, a forced repetition. The pain is not the focus, but it is a part of the ritual, a reminder of how serious this path is. But there are moments of pride, too. The first time you copy the name of a king correctly. The first time your lines are neat, your spelling accurate. The first time the teacher nods, just barely, and moves on without correction. Some days you carry heavy tablets, others you help clean the schoolhouse, knead new clay, or mix ink for temple scribes. Your duties are small, but each is a step on a narrow road. And the texts, they begin to reveal themselves. You do not just copy names, but learn their meanings. You trace lines from the Epic of Gilgamesh, feeling the gravity of myth and memory pass through your stylus. You study mathematics, not with numbers as we know them, but with intricate systems of base 60. You practice lists of birds, of fish, of cities, and gods. You recite hymns in Sumerian, even though your spoken tongue is Akkadian. The ancient language is dead, but sacred. You do not question why you learn it. It is simply what is done. In time, you might write a contract for your teacher, a mock agreement about barley or land. You might practice seals, rolling a cylinder across wet clay, watching as the intricate image unfolds. Sometimes you dream of becoming a royal scribe, of standing beside a king in a temple court, of holding records that shape the fate of cities. But those are distant thoughts, tucked behind the thrum of daily repetition. For now, your world is ink, clay, and discipline. At midday, you break for a short meal, perhaps bread and onions wrapped in cloth. You sit in shade if you can find it. Your hands are dry, dusted with clay. Sometimes you talk with the other boys, murmuring jokes or sharing stories from home, and then it's back to work. The marks must be perfect, the stories must be remembered, and your fingers, your back, your brow, all must serve the quiet task of preserving the voice of civilization. You are tired, but purposeful, and as the sun begins to lower, casting long shadows through the small open windows of the Edaba, you carefully wipe clean your tablet, smearing away your morning S-work to prepare the clay anew, because learning is never finished here. And in Mesopotamia, to write was to touch the divine. Now, let the light dim a little in your imagination. The schoolroom fades, and we step gently into a quieter space, softer, deeper, more mysterious. Because, for all the structure of scribal life and all the predictability of household routine, there was another world, ever present and just beyond the edge of understanding, a spiritual world, a world of charms, rituals, omens, and whispers in the dark. To be a child in ancient Mesopotamia was not only to learn the names of gods and kings, but to live in their shadow. From the moment of birth, a child was placed under the protection of divine beings. A priest or midwife might recite prayers as the infant cried for the first time. The stars would be consulted, the placement of the planets, the shape of the moon, all studied, all weighed. Astrology was not a curiosity. It was a serious way to interpret fate, and a child's life was thought to hang delicately on unseen threads. Imagine yourself, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, holding a small clay figurine in your palm. It might be your protective demon, not a demon in the way we understand today, but a guardian of a kind, Lamashtu, Pazuzu, names that fluttered through lullabies and warnings alike. Your mother might wear a charm on a cord pressed to your chest during sleep, a tiny tablet carved with protective words to keep away fever, to ward off dreams, to hush the invisible spirits that were said to steal breath in the night. Disease was not understood in biological terms. It came as a curse, a punishment, or a visitation. And so, families surrounded their children with defenses not made of walls, but of words. The incantation was an anchor. The ritual was a shield. There were ceremonies, too, small but meaningful. Perhaps your first haircut dedicated to a god, or your naming celebrated with an offering of grain and incense at the household altar. Your home might have had a tiny shrine, a recessed niche in the wall, where idols stood in silence. And in the temples, far larger rituals took place. But for children, spirituality was woven quietly into the daily rhythm. Even your toys held echoes of the unknown. Simple ones, like spinning tops carved from date stones, or pull carts made from clay with wooden wheels, or animal figurines that might double as teaching tools and talismans. Play and prayer were not separate realms, and when children passed away, as tragically many did in a world where medicine was fragile, they were buried with care. In some homes, a family might dig beneath the floor, laying the child to rest wrapped in cloth, surrounded by small offerings. A toy, a cup, a fragment of tablet. Sometimes a lullaby would be chanted one last time. The body returned to the earth, but the soul, that was watched by the gods. There was an idea, never quite fixed, that the soul lingered, that the dead could influence the living. And so memory became ritual. A mother lighting incense on the anniversary of her child's death. A father whispering a name beneath his breath before sleep. These were quiet acts of remembrance, acts of comfort in a world that often felt unpredictable. And so, in the great cities of your Uruk and Nippur, amid the dust of alleyways and the hush of temples, children lived within a tapestry of the seen and the unseen. They learned to write, but also to watch the skies, to play, but also to listen for omens, to laugh, but always in the company of spirits, both protective and perilous. For in Mesopotamia, childhood was never just physical, it was spiritual, and each step was a negotiation with the unknown. Now, let us lift our gaze from the narrow homes and mud-brick courtyards to something grander, something that gleams faintly under the Mesopotamian sun. Imagine soft sandals brushing polished stone, a world far removed from the street vendors, the reed huts, the crowded markets, to be born into a noble house or a royal lineage. In ancient Mesopotamia was to begin life not just with promise, but with expectation. Your name might be etched on a clay tablet within days of birth, your lineage carefully recorded. A priest may have blessed you on behalf of the gods, not just for health, but for destiny. Your garments would be fine woven linen rather than rough wool. Your jewelry, yes, even as a child, might include small gold amulets or tiny lapis beads, symbols not only of wealth, but of divine favor, and your education would begin early, but with far more luxury than your common-born peers. In the scriptoriums of great temples or the private chambers of tutors, you'd learn cuneiform, not just to record grain, but to write hymns, legal codes, diplomatic letters, even in multiple languages like Sumerian and Akkadian. For you were not simply learning to survive, you were learning to lead. If you were a girl and born into privilege, your life still followed a structured, elevated path. You may have been taught to manage a household, oversee servants, or read rituals aloud during ceremonies. In some city-states, elite women became priestesses, powerful and respected figures. Perhaps your family groomed you for such a role. You might have walked temple corridors in white robes, reciting invocations to Inanna beneath torchlight. And if you were a boy born into a ruling family, the weight of the future settled early on your shoulders. Your father may have been a governor, a general, or a king's advisor. And so, your play involved model chariots, mock court sessions, or the symbolic handing of seals, clay cylinders engraved with intricate scenes used to mark authority. In some cases, royal children were married off in diplomatic unions before they could even fully grasp what marriage meant. The ink of power dried faster than most could mature. Yet, even with this privilege, the children of the elite were still children. They may have had wet nurses, caretakers, and even entertainers. Small carved animals, board games like the game of 20 squares, and delicate rattles have been found in royal tombs. There were gardens to wander, palm groves to shade the sun, terraces where you could gaze across the cityscape and imagine the world you'd one day help to rule. But, as ever in Mesopotamia, privilege did not protect one from the gods. Omens still loomed. Illness could strike even in a palace. A misread star could turn a family's fortune. A drought could topple a dynasty. So you too might wear a charm. Even the highest child had dreams visited by restless spirits, or heard in the silence of their chambers the winds of Ishtar or the breath of Enlil brushing the curtains. In one tomb, believed to be that of a princess, archaeologists uncovered jewelry, musical instruments, and tiny drinking cups. Signs of wealth, yes, but also signs of a life that ended early. The elite, like all in Mesopotamia, lived in proximity to both privilege and precariousness. Still, for the few who did grow to adulthood, the foundations of their leadership were shaped early. They learned to read the skies, judge character, command words and servants alike. And so, childhood at the top was not idle. It was training. An apprenticeship for the throne, the temple, or the estate. As we leave behind the dusty courtyards and sun-drenched rooftops of ancient Mesopotamia, as the soft clay tablets are tucked away, and the distant murmur of temple chants fades into silence, you might begin to feel the centuries shifting once more beneath your feet. The warm breeze of the Tigris gives way to a colder, damp stillness. The scent of incense becomes the sting of mildew and rust, and far above, the world grows narrower, darker. Now, imagine yourself walking down a corridor, not lined with reeds or scrolls, but with heavy doors, reinforced by iron, and groaning under the weight of centuries of sorrow. We are no longer in the cradles of civilization. We are descending into something harsher, the shadowed underbelly of medieval Europe. Here, the world is smaller, quieter, and far less forgiving. Our next journey takes us behind the walls of stone keeps and forgotten towers, into places not meant to nurture, but to break, to contain, to punish. Places where the echoes you hear aren't children at play, but the slow drip of water, the scurry of rats, and the murmurs of those who wait. In the episode to come, we'll explore what it was truly like to be confined in a medieval prison, not from the pages of legend, but through the lived, cramped, and often desperate realities of the time. So, settle in. Let the stone walls rise gently around you, and prepare to step into the cold stillness of history's darker corners. This is why you wouldn't survive in a medieval prison. Imagine, just for a moment, that you are no longer resting comfortably in your bed, but rather curled up on the damp stone floor of a medieval prison. There is no mattress, no blanket, no pillow. Just a thin layer of straw scattered across the uneven ground, a futile attempt at comfort against the cold, unyielding stone. The air here is still, heavy with moisture, and tinged with the sour scent of mold, human waste, and decay. Light filters in dimly through a tiny slit high on the wall, if at all. Time passes slowly, if it passes at all. The world outside fades into memory, and you become one of the forgotten. In many medieval towns and cities, prisons were not institutions of rehabilitation. They were holding pens, temporary spaces for those awaiting trial, judgment, or execution. They were not designed with long-term habitation in mind. Yet many people spent weeks, months, even years inside. Often, the crime was minor. A debt unpaid, a quarrel that turned physical, or even mere suspicion. You would not be alone in your cell. These spaces were crammed and overcrowded. There were no individual cells, as we might imagine today. Instead, a single room might hold a dozen people, perhaps more, with no separation between men, women, or children. Privacy was a luxury that did not exist here. At night, the sounds of coughing, muttering, and occasional sobbing became a sort of lullaby if one could sleep at all. The straw under you was shared, crawling with lice and fleas. Rats moved freely along the corners of the room, emboldened by the scraps of food and human refuse. Sanitation was primitive at best. A single bucket might serve as the latrine for the entire cell, emptied irregularly by a reluctant jailer. The smell alone was overwhelming. Infections were rampant, with wounds and sores often left untreated. Disease spread quickly, aided by the close quarters and poor nutrition. Food, when it came, was basic and barely sustaining. Prisoners were often dependent on charity from family, religious institutions, or the kindness of strangers. Bread that was hard and stale, water that tasted of the wood it had been stored in, perhaps a bit of gruel if you were lucky. There were no guarantees. If you had no one on the outside to provide for you, you might starve. And then there was the silence of neglect. Jailers were not always brutal, but they were distant, indifferent. They were there to keep you in, not to care for you. Bribes might make your stay more bearable. Better corner of the room, a bit more food, or leniency with visitors. But without coin, your fate was tied to the mercy of routine, and routine rarely changed. Some prisons were little more than dungeons beneath castles, dark, windowless, and sunk beneath layers of stone. These places were colder still. Others were repurposed buildings converted to house prisoners temporarily. But wherever you were, the defining qualities remained: darkness, cold, filth, and uncertainty. There was little to do. Time stretched endlessly. Conversations filled the hours, but so did silence. Some prisoners prayed. Others stared blankly at the wall. Many were forgotten by the outside world. In this space, your identity slowly withered. You became not a person, but a prisoner, a body among many, a name on a list, if even that. The rhythm of your days was not determined by clocks or calendars, but by the infrequent appearance of a jailer, the dull clang of a metal gate, or the distant sound of footsteps overhead. This was your life, not as a villain, not as a monster, but as someone simply caught within a system. A life stripped of dignity, comfort, and even basic warmth. And this is why, truly, you would not survive long in a medieval prison. Not because of torture or execution, though those came too, but because the daily grind of deprivation, neglect, and slow decay would erode your body and your spirit, one breath at a time. Let us now lift the torch a little higher and walk toward a darker, more intimate story, that of a soul entangled not in stone walls, but in the story of power and fate. Now, imagine you were once admired, revered, even. Picture yourself in fine armor, astride a war horse, your name whispered in awe across battlefields and banquet halls. You were a noble, a man of immense wealth and prestige. You had fought beside Joan of Arc. You had dined with kings. And yet, despite all that, your story would end in a medieval prison. Let us step quietly into the life of Gilles. Gilles de Rais was everything one might imagine of a medieval aristocrat, heir to vast estates, a warrior in the 100 Years' War, and eventually a Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors in the realm. His lineage was old and respected, his power immense. But beneath the velvet and armor, something darker stirred. At first, his decline was merely whispered about extravagant spending, failed alchemical experiments, mysterious disappearances on his lands. He withdrew more and more into private estates, building a theatrical troupe, surrounding himself with strange advisors, dabbling in occult rituals. Rumors grew, peasants began to vanish. It wasn't until years later, in 1440, that the walls finally closed in. Arrested on charges of heresy, sorcery, and most infamously the abduction and murder of dozens, perhaps hundreds of children. Yale was imprisoned in the dungeons of nuns. His trial, though official in form, was a grim performance. But here we do not dwell on the gore or the accusations. Instead, we focus on the man and what it meant to fall so far. Imagine the change. The same stone walls we explored in segment 1 now surround a man who once walked beside princes. The damp straw, the fetid air, the echoing corridors, now the domain of a nobleman reduced to nothing. Stripped of his garments, his titles, his servants. No tapestries here, no candles in rottern holders, no music drifting through his halls, just the same stone, the same rot, the same quiet despair. Records tell us, he confessed, perhaps it was guilt, perhaps fear, perhaps torture of a kind more psychological than physical. His final days were filled with prayer and repentance. Whether sincere or theatrical, we cannot know. But we do know this: he wept, he prayed aloud. He begged for forgiveness before his execution. And we are left with a chilling truth, not only of his alleged crimes, but of the transience of power. One day, you dine with royalty. The next, you sleep on the same lice-ridden straw as the lowest thief. The story of guilty race is not meant to shock. Rather, it is a quiet meditation on the fall from grace, on the weight of stone walls closing in. No matter how gilded your past, he was not the only nobleman to meet such a fate, but perhaps among the most haunting. His prison cell did not care who he had been. The rats did not pause at his name. The darkness did not recede for the sake of his titles. He became what all prisoners become, alone, waiting, forgotten. In his final hours, he asked to be executed with dignity, accompanied by a priest, surrounded by prayer. He was granted this last shred of ritual, but not mercy. From the flickering candlelight of castles to the smothering darkness of prison, Ulysses de Reyes walked both worlds. And in doing so, he reminds us, medieval prisons were equalizers of the harshest kind. Within their walls, all are stripped bare. Now, let us turn from one man's tale to the traces left behind the artifacts. The stones, the strange remnants unearthed that continue to whisper secrets through the centuries. Let us now descend even deeper, not into a tale of one person, but into the faint remains left behind by many. Stone walls, iron hinges, weather-worn graffiti. These are the silent witnesses to lives that once passed through the prison system of medieval Europe. Archaeology does not always shout. Often, it whispers. And in the case of medieval prisons, it is a whisper muffled by layers of dust, mortar, and time. These were not always grand structures, marked and memorialized. Many prisons were humble, hidden, and poorly recorded. But even in their silence, they tell us much. In York, England, beneath the weight of what is now a museum, archaeologists uncovered remnants of a once operational prison from the 14th century. What they found was not just stone and timber, but something far more personal: scratchings etched into the walls, names, crosses, even a few small drawings. These were not meant to be art, but marks of presence, of identity, of protest, perhaps, or prayer. One prisoner had etched a perfect circle again and again, over and over, into the plaster, a compulsion, a meditation, a way to mark time. We cannot know, but we can feel in those repetitive strokes a kind of restless waiting, a rhythm of captivity. Further south, in the quiet shadows beneath the Tower of London, lies the infamous Beauchamp Tower. This was not a dungeon for commoners, but a prison for the politically significant nobles, clergy, and members of royal families who had fallen from grace. Here, the graffiti takes a different tone. Intricate carvings of coats of arms, religious iconography, entire inscriptions in Latin, some dated and signed. One prisoner, John Dudley, left behind an elaborate carving of his family crest. The detail is astonishing, carved into stone with nothing more than improvised tools. He knew he would not leave alive, and so he left his mark. Elsewhere, traces are more elusive. In Eastern Europe, archaeologists exploring castle ruins sometimes stumble upon hidden cells, small chambers. In one Bohemian fortress, a vertical shaft no wider than a man's shoulders was discovered beneath a collapsed chapel. At the bottom, a tiny cell barely large enough to sit in. It had no door, only a rope, once used to lower prisoners down. There were no carvings here, only the oppressive silence of stone. Tiny entries, quickly made, and yet they are now the only record that these people ever lived or suffered. Even the tools of imprisonment, shackles, locks, and keys offer quiet insights. A set of rusted iron cuffs found buried in a Scottish abbey. A cellar suggests that the monastic community may have had its own makeshift holding cell. Not all imprisonment was state-sanctioned. The church, too, held its own authority. And then there are the architectural echoes. In many medieval towns, one might find a small, narrow doorway set low into a larger building, a door that leads nowhere today, or has long since been bricked over. These were often entrances to holding cells, tucked beneath guild halls, or next to market squares, public yet obscured, known but unspoken. All these remnants, graffiti, architecture, objects tell us something important. Imprisonment was not rare, nor only for the most wicked. It was a common thread woven into the fabric of medieval life. It is easy to imagine medieval prisons as places of horror, only the domain of torture and cruelty. And indeed, those things existed, but they were also places of waiting, of negotiation. And for many, they were simply where you ended up when you could not pay a debt, or when someone more powerful decided your fate. Archaeology allows us to see not the legend, but the lived experience. It invites us to step into the quiet spaces, to run our fingers in our minds along the worn stone where someone once rested their head, night after night, to imagine the sound of breath in the dark, the slow drip of water from a ceiling crack, the feel of wood swelling with damp and iron rusting in the cold. These places endure, even if their stories are half buried, and they remind us, gently, that history is not always written in ink, but in scratches, in dust, in silence. And now we turn our attention to the other side of the cell door, to those who built the prisons, who passed judgment, who observed from gilded seats while others sat in straw. Step now beyond the bars and into the long stone corridors of judgment, away from the chill of the cell and into the solemn, echoing chambers of authority. Here, light returns. Candles flicker from iron sconces. Robes rustle. A gavel rests on a worn bench, untouched. This is the world of the jailer, the magistrate, the lord, the free. For every prisoner confined behind iron, there was someone who decided their fate. Someone with the luxury to walk home at night, to sleep in a feather bed, to dine by a fire. Justice in the medieval world was not uniform. It bent and shifted according to rank, wealth, gender, and geography. A nobleman accused of treason might await judgment in a comfortable tower chamber, complete with servants and meals delivered hot. A peasant charged with stealing a loaf might rot in a pit beneath a market square. In cities like Florence and Bruges, legal proceedings took place in civic palaces, grandeur, and order, cloaking the messy realities of accusation. Thick parchment documents recorded testimonies, often colored by social standing. A merchant's word held more weight than a servant's. A priest's account could sway a jury with a single phrase. Magistrates, drawn from the upper classes, administered justice from raised platforms, cloaked in robes of wool and fur. They did not descend into the cells they governed. They did not breathe the same air. Instead, their perceptions of prison were abstract an idea, a punishment, a tool, not a place one visited, and rarely a place one questioned. Even among jailers, those who served as the bridge between judgment and punishment, there was a hierarchy. Some were low-born and cruel, others indifferent, a few even compassionate, but always they retained the power of movement. They could step out into the light. Prisoners could not. Some nobles took imprisonment seriously, not as an act of cruelty, but of stewardship. Wealthy families might fund better prison infrastructure, especially if their own were at risk of confinement. A benefactor might pay for straw bedding or for a chapel within the prison walls. These acts were not always altruistic. They also soothed reputations and ensured divine favor. In England, the sheriff was responsible for maintaining local jails. His role was administrative, but his negligence could mean disease or death for those inside. A well-connected prisoner might bribe the sheriff for access to food, letters, or visits. A poor one had no such luck. And then, above even the sheriff, stood the crown. Monarchs occasionally intervened in legal affairs, pardoning prisoners, commuting sentences, or ordering executions. These decisions were political, symbolic. Rarely did they reflect the nuances of the prisoner's suffering. Yet, from a distant hall, a single stroke of a quill could change the trajectory of a life. Consider, for a moment, the courtiers at court, sipping warm wine as they debate matters of governance. Around them, tapestries of battles, of hunts, of justice served. Beyond the thick walls of their estates, the prisons persist, but far out of mind. They exist somewhere downriver, past the farms, beneath the old chapel, in the city's underbelly. Out of sight, and certainly out of hearing. This contrast between power and confinement was not accidental. It was structural. Those in power relied upon prisons not as places to reform, but to control. A body locked away was a message sent, a threat neutralized. A burden moved off stage, and yet, even among the elite, prison was never entirely foreign. There are stories quiet, rare of nobles who fell from grace and felt, for the first time, the cold sting of iron. Richard II, once King of England, was deposed and imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. His cell was not a dungeon, but it was still confinement, still silence, still the long, slow undoing of self. So, you see, the medieval prison was not simply a space. It was a mirror, reflecting society's fractures, enforcing boundaries, marking who was safe and who was not. You, listening now, would almost certainly have been among the many, not the few, vulnerable to rumor, to accusation, to poverty, to bad luck. You would not have known the weight of a robe or the feel of a signet ring, but you might have known the smell of straw and the echo of footsteps as the cell door creaked shut. And that is why you would not have survived, might because you lacked courage, but because you lacked power. And in the medieval world, that made all the difference. Let us now gently step back from the past, from the clatter of keys and the flicker of torchlight. Let us ease toward rest with one final reflection. And so, as the final echoes of iron gates and hollow footsteps begin to fade, let us slowly return from that cold, damp cell and back into the quiet safety of the present. The world you've just wandered through, its shadows, its silences, its small cruelties, was once real. It existed not in fables or grim fantasy, but in stone and straw, in echoing chambers and forgotten names etched lightly into the walls. The medieval prison was not designed for comfort, nor for rehabilitation. It was, instead, a waiting place, a place of stillness and of slow unraveling, a station between accusation and fate. It held bodies, but also time that stretched, frayed, and broke the spirit. To survive, such a place would have required more than strength. It would have required fortune, influence, coin, or the favor of someone watching from above. Most who entered did not possess these things. Most were, like you might have been, simply caught within systems, suspicions, and circumstances beyond control. And yet, they endured for a time. In that dim light, voices whispered, fingers clutched rosary beads, eyes closed, not always in sleep, but in escape. Even in the worst conditions, humanity flickered like a candle in the draft's maw, persistent and quietly brave. Now, imagine yourself drawing the blanket closer around you. Your bed is warm. Your room is quiet. The walls are clean, and the air carries no stench, no dread, no echo of boots in a corridor. You are free. And in that freedom lies the ultimate contrast. History, in all its starkness, invites gratitude, not through guilt or drama, but through reflection, through understanding how deeply comfort is shaped by time and place, by who we are and by who we are not. Let your breath settle now. Let your thoughts drift. The past has spoken softly tonight. Its whispers have filled the room. But now, it's time to let go. The walls have vanished. The straw has disappeared. The door, long locked, has creaked open. Sleep now, gently and deeply. You are far from the prison. Good night.